Hey, everybody, sort of an impromptu stream here. Hopefully, this should be showing up on Substack, X, and YouTube simultaneously. So if you're subscribed to one or not the other, go to M Tracy on YouTube, mtracy.net, which is Substack, and then at M Tracy, of course, on Twitter/X. So why am I making this impromptu stream? Well, the title is a clue. Epstein mania continues to engulf us all. And I guess I wanted to make a few meta points or just a few sort of broader perspective observations because it's pretty interesting. Everybody, every comment thread that's been attached to anything I've said or done on this topic over the past few days has been violently hostile toward me. And there's a little bit of a conundrum there because on the one hand, I don't want to discount comments. Like I've always engaged with commenters. People will randomly email me or tweet me or message me or post below what I've posted. And yeah, sure, oftentimes it's just a slog of nonsense, but every now and then you get a diamond in the rough or there's something useful that gets ferreted out. So I've never been one to say just don't read the comments, ignore what everybody's on the internet is saying about you. Well, I mean, aren't we supposed to be sort of intentionally engaging in a interactive medium? Uh that's what I thought, or that's how I've always sort of thought about it. So I find that if you're commenting on a topic that it provokes a reaction that's just bitterly uh, aggressively negative, you have to sort of think through how to process that because you don't want to just be arbitrarily in opposition to what the consensus view seems to be in these comment sections. And I'm talking about YouTube, X, um, emails and stuff that I've gotten pretty much everywhere that I can receive feedback. Overwhelmingly, bitterly negative. And so you have to think through like, okay, am I going to intentionally just antagonize or instigate people for its own sake? No, I at least would like to think that that's not what's motivating me. I would like to think what is motivating me is authentic reasoning to the best of my ability, good faith attempt to process, synthesize information, often report information from a variety of sources, primary sources, sometimes my own original, reporting, run the gamut. And then send that out into the public with the aim of better informing people or presenting arguments that people might not have considered but may find persuasive. Just sort of raising the level of public knowledge ever so incrementally in whatever way I can. That's, I think, an apt encapsulation of how I think of what I do here. So I don't want to just be arbitrarily oppositional to what seems to be the consensus view that emerges on online platforms. But I also am very cognizant of the temptation to engage in audience capture or to succumb to audience capture. That phenomenon is everywhere. It's very depressing. It's very predictable. Here's what happens. People generate an audience. They generate followers, subscribers, etc. Oftentimes their livelihood, their ability to produce income is intertwined with those audiences and followerships that they develop. So they end up discerning an algorithmic sweet spot in which they can throw uh, a regular series of red meat goodies, and the audience gobbles them up. The subscriber numbers and the follower numbers continue to go up, and all's good in the world. Not that difficult to comprehend. And I find that to be, in general, an extremely pervasive and even pernicious phenomenon within online media in particular. Not that audience capture doesn't apply to more conventional or mainstream media. I just think that online media has a particular dynamic with audience capture where the audiences that can be developed are a little bit more niche and narrow. And so I think that the incentives that arise to cater to certain audiences are a little bit more straightforward than would be the case for, I don't know, like the New York Times or what have you. Now, maybe if I thought about that comparison a little more, I would have a bit of a different angle on it. It's all just to say that online media and audience capture is a particular thing that I feel ought to be guarded against, and so often isn't. So I could, if I wanted to, just uh, cater to the crowd. I could just jump on board with the dominant conception of the Epstein story, and that would be great for me algorithmically. It's clear what the incentives are on X, YouTube, etc. Nobody wants to hear, basically, the perspective that I've developed over the years as I've followed this story. Now, I should note that I'm not somebody who's been a habitual, constant chronicler of all things Epstein. Like, there have been times when I've tuned it out for long periods of time, but I've read enough court documents. I've followed the various ins and outs of different aspects of this saga uh, enough that I have what I feel to be enough information to make reasonably informed observations. And so when the Trump DOJ and FBI put out that statement a few nights ago, basically shuttering, closing the door on any further Epstein investigation, essentially disclaiming the very existence of the supposed Epstein files that people in the administration like Kash Patel, Dan Bongino, Pam Bondi, etc., had dangled in front of their audiences. Because that's what they're doing. They're playing to the audience. In a way, it's a kind of audience capture on their part. People in this administration, it seems, are always operating within an incentive structure that compels them to be perpetually mindful of how what they're saying or what their messaging will resonate with right-wing social media, essentially, as found on X, I would say, for the most part, because Musk was a member of the administration until recently. So the imperative to uh, cater to right-wing social media as manifested on X, that imperative was very strong. And when I've talked to people in and around the administration, a common theme is, yeah, people who have a public facing role are constantly trying to figure out how they can best tailor their messaging or their output to the kind of beating heart of right wing sentiment as found on X. That could be a double edged sword for obvious reasons. One reason is that people like Bongino, who actually was in full bore the right wing online media as a Rumble broadcaster, I guess you would say, one of the most prominent on that platform, and also on X. They're taking cues constantly from what their audience's preferences are, and if the audience is indicating that they're really inflamed about the purported Epstein files that they've been led to believe were being deviously and malevolently concealed by the Biden administration for some reason, because Democrats love to protect their pedophile friends and donors, I guess. That then Dan Bongino is going to, in a sort of feedback loop, absorb those sentiments and project them back at his audience. In a similar way, Kash Patel, between 2021 and 2024, what was he doing? He was trying to raise his profile amongst the right wing media ecosystem in hopes of eventually putting himself in the running for a prominent administration job should Trump win the election. And in the meantime, having all these enterprises and ventures to make money on trinkets and I don't know, subscriptions for various things like tchotchkes. But the strategy worked in that Kash Patel, as he's going around to all these podcasts and so forth, obviously is able to apprehend, because he's not an unintelligent person, that what the audience wants to hear is the most tantalizing rendition of what's going on with the quote unquote Epstein files. So if you really want to get them on the edge of their seats, if you really want to get them jazzed up and excited to vote in the Republicans at the next possible opportunity, what you'd probably say is, yeah, the FBI director has the Epstein files in his I don't know, vault or something. He's sitting on them. He personally controls them, but he's concealing them because, I guess the implication is, under the reign of Biden, there's a directive that's gone out that the federal government must protect perpetrators of child sex crimes or something like that. Of course, the audience eats that right up. They love to hear that. The right wing social media firmament, in particular, sort of needs needs a child sex trafficking ring, like a mythical child sex trafficking ring that's intertwined with like Satanism and demons and all these other kind of like spiritually corrupt practices and phenomena. The right wing id in particular really needs that just to sustain itself. It's like a sustenance for them. Hence the QAnon phenomenon from the first Trump administration, which I do think the Epstein fixation borrows from significantly on the right anyway. There's some crossover on the left in terms of people who are very exercised about Epstein, but talking about the right, because they're the ones running the federal government at the moment. They're the ones having their social media sort of instincts pandered to. It seems like there needs the way that their bloodstream gets pumped. Well, let me figure out my metaphor here. You sort of you pump blood into the bloodstream of that right wing ecosystem by feeding an endless sequence of child sex trafficking stories, sex trafficking theories, and of course the depraved elites, mostly Democrats, so the way they would think of it is it's the Democrats who are largely responsible for this depraved cover up of the child sex trafficking ring that we know must be existent and is corrupting our youth and destroying Christianity. But they're also aided and abetted by like some rhino or establishment Republicans that we're also going to dislodge from power. That's basically how it would go. Um, but clearly, there's like a primal urge to believe that the way that power is distributed in society is decisively determined by illicit child sex trafficking operations and then like the blackmail component that always accompanies that in one way or another. That was the case. That's what animated the whole QAnon thing, right? Um, Now it is true that the Epstein story or Epstein saga, I'm calling it Epstein mythology primarily. It is true that the Epstein thing has a much more tangible, factual predicate than the QAnon thing ever did, which is basically just this like hallucinatory online, confabulation or like a choose your own adventure, hero's journey or something where you get fed all these like exciting cryptic messages and you had to decode things and it was like Raiders of the Lost Ark or exploring ancient Egyptian pyramids or for the hieroglyphics. Like that's kind of like what the tone or the appeal seemed to be. Epstein's more tangible. It's true. Epstein was real. He was in the 2000s charged with prostitution. He hired a bunch of high-powered attorneys who negotiated what was seen as a lenient plea agreement, etc. He really was indicted and arrested in 2019, died under what seemed to be peculiar circumstances while incarcerated. And there was actually a trial of one of his longtime associates, Ghislaine Maxwell, who was convicted. So, like, it's in a different category altogether from QAnon in terms of like the tangibility of it. I'm just suggesting that there are certain themes that cross over in terms of why this is so enlivening and why this is so rousing of passion amongst a certain segment of the online right in particular. Now, the online left is not irrelevant here. I would say that there's also a long running fixation amongst the left with sex trafficking, which stems from different premises. It's more revolved around concern for hierarchy or power imbalance or empowering marginalized identity groups. So I had an article that came out today at Compact Magazine. If people are interested, I put some excerpts in a Substack post that I also just published, which is in the description box if you're watching this on YouTube. But I compare because I had this sort of in my files that I never ended up doing with anything with, but I decided to repurpose it because, frankly, the entire sex trafficking and human trafficking uh, industries, like the advocacy industries, and how they interact with government agencies and private foundations and so forth, is exceptionally ripe for further interrogation, investigation, and reporting. I've done some of it incrementally over the years, probably mostly the past 2 to 3 years, I guess. Um, but maybe I should devote some more sustained effort to that at some point because it's amazing how under examined or under scrutinized that whole complex is. But you can find, interestingly enough, NGOs of a manifestly right wing orientation and a little more left wing orientation that are both focused on combating sex trafficking slash human trafficking from from different premises. On the right, it's about typically something to do with Christian ministry, saving the so-called survivors of trafficking by offering them salvation, ridding them of sin, and ministering to them in the name of God. I'm not exaggerating when I make that characterization. I don't think that's basically the general tenor of the right wing variants of this, and then the left wing ones, again, more secular, more maybe materialist, more focused on power imbalances and identity groups. And so these different variations of sex trafficking NGOs nonetheless tend to converge on the same endpoint, which is finding the most extravagant way they possibly can to inflate the sex trafficking data, which is wildly imprecise if you ever take a second to dig into the details. Essentially, these groups just throw out numbers, and government agencies also just throw out like the craziest possible numbers. Like I don't have them off the top of my head, but like every January, I think there's something called the International Human Trafficking Awareness Day or whatever. Like both presidents of both parties proclaim like a declaration on that day, and they make these like insane numerical claims about how many people in the world are enslaved, like modern day slavery, they call it. Um, and anyway, there's just fodder for endless amounts of resources to be poured into law enforcement, to NGOs, and to all this whole entire constellation of groups in the name of combating human trafficking that are really subject to no evaluative criteria to speak of. Um, if you in any way question or express skepticism about the necessity of these kinds of organizations or efforts, you're defending sex trafficking, you're defending all kinds of sexual depravities, et cetera, et cetera. And so these groups are just kind of immunized from any kind of scrutiny. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit far afield here, but it relates to the Epstein thing because, in terms of how I'm perceiving the public response to what it is that I've been saying lately, again, it's just incredibly bitter vitriol aimed at me. And what happens is I get impugned for somehow being, compromised myself. Maybe I'm on the Epstein list. People maybe say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think there are people who would genuinely suspect that I have some secret, ulterior, nefarious motive. That I'm trolling. Anything but the merits of the argument will they consider as the explanation for why it is that I take the view that I do. Um, and so one does have to, at least from my perspective, have to figure out how to navigate that dynamic because you don't want to be led astray from your intuitions or your reasoning by this outsized negativity that you're being swamped with. Um, while at the same time, you don't necessarily want to just, again, sort of instigate or antagonize people for its own sake. And I do think that, in the various venues that I've been on the past few days. So I did the Unheard podcast. I did one of the two-way shows on the Two-Way Network today. I did the Compact thing. Did a Substack. I've done a bunch of Twitter Spaces or whatever. I hadn't planned to get engrossed in this issue really. I was wanting to be working on something else this week, but I kind of got just swept away in the news cycle for better or worse. But I do find like if you sort of engage with people, at least there's some acknowledgement eventually that maybe like you're onto something. And let me just be clear. I mean, the bottom line is I'm not trying to disprove that there's anything amiss or anything suspicious or anything um, worthy of intrigue associated with the Epstein story. Obviously, it's a phenomenally sensational story in all kinds of ways. My issue is that it's taken as a matter of like dogmatic faith. People have such unshakable conviction that the bottom line here is that there was a sprawling child sex trafficking ring and blackmail network that's been covered up, and there was an expectation that Trump and his band of anti-deep state warriors were going to charge into the federal government and finally vanquish all these deep state malefactors who had been busy concealing the truth from the public. And yet, in a shocking twist, turns out that Trump and his subordinates are actually now in on the cover up. I think that's basically what people seem to believe, right? I mean, if you were to distill down to its essence what people are so uh, indignant about right now, that basically covers it, right? Um, and my issue is that from any empirical angle that you may wish to take, it simply cannot be factually sustained that those assumptions are correct. Or let me rephrase slightly. The idea that I just tried to articulate that I think would constitute the essence of what people think is really going on here, i.e., that Epstein orchestrated a sprawling child sex trafficking ring, and enlisted or entrapped prominent men, prominent individuals by putting them into compromising sexual situations, surreptitiously taping them, and then using that as blackmail against them to get their silence or their complicity or whatever. Now, to what end was the blackmail? Who's to say? There's plenty of speculation that's rife on the internet. But that's basically the core of the claim, right? That's why people are aggrieved. That's why people think that they've been betrayed, because the thing that they wanted to believe was going to be revealed by the Trump administration has instead been further concealed. And the thing that they thought was going to be revealed, I would contend, is divorced from most observable empirical reality. Now, people don't want to hear that. People get extraordinarily upset if they're told that. But I think that's the case. Doesn't mean that, oh, there's like, there was nothing ever mysterious about Epstein, or there's nothing to see here, or et cetera, et cetera. No, I'm saying like the core grandiose sort of claim that undergirds the outsized public reaction to the Epstein files not being released, that core claim, I think, is not sustainable by the facts that are available in the empirical universe. Okay. Now, why do I say that? I'll go over a few reasons. Number one, unfortunately, is Virginia Giuffre. And this is like a minefield because again, you can't scrutinize this person apparently because number one, she's deceased, which we're all supposed to be respectful of, I guess. Number two, she's a quote survivor, she was trafficked, etc. And therefore, no scrutiny allowed, even though she was the progenitor of this entire saga, essentially. If there was a if the Epstein mythology, as I put it, has a creation myth or like an origin story, she's the one who generated that origin story. She's the myth maker because in December of 2014, so over a decade ago now, she infamously joined an ongoing lawsuit with a filing that made a series of wild accusations about her having been trafficked to, she said, prime ministers and presidents and all manner of people. And she named some in particular: Alan Dershowitz, uh, Bill Richardson, the former governor of New Mexico, George Mitchell, the former majority leader of the United States Senate, Prince Andrew, and among a myriad others. And she would also, so that was in the form of a court filing, but she also had given interviews starting in 2011 for which she was paid lavishly. I hadn't realized this until pretty recently, but the first time she gave a big interview to the Daily Mail or the Mail on Sunday in 2011, she was paid out the wazoo for it. It was like $160,000 for doing a little interview for a online for a Daily Mail item, and also her providing that photo of her, purportedly with Prince Andrew. 160,000, and she's gotten paid for other stuff over the years. That's separate and apart from her settlement money, from which she became wealthy. Based on what I can gather, I would put it at maybe at least like $13 million in total, probably much more than that actually, but minimum 13, 14, 15 million just from the settlements she was able to wrangle from Prince Andrew, from Ghislaine Maxwell, from Epstein's estate, from J.P. Morgan, from the British royal family. So this idea that she's just like this, even though she's currently deceased, that she's this perpetually beleaguered victim who nobody can scrutinize, otherwise you're some kind of sexual predator yourself, is just insane. I mean, she became a public activist, a public advocate. She's on the media circuit. She's running an NGO, which she got the Queen to fund to the tune of, I think it was 2.7 million, and her NGO to raise awareness about sex trafficking seemingly just did nothing. She just let it sit there with her on the board. And if you look at the website over the past few years, when she started this outfit, it basically just functioned as a web portal for her to like organize and collate her, curate her media appearances. So please, the idea that you can't scrutinize this person, given her outsized influence and how integral she was in the creation of this mythology around Epstein, that's just idiotic. And so, what's the conclusion that I think one must inevitably reach if you're at all rational about this? This person, Virginia Giuffre, again, on whom the entire Epstein mythology essentially rests, was a serial fabricator. Now, why does all the mythology rest on her? Because she was the original and most influential accuser, and she claimed that she was trafficked to all these prominent people, right? That's not the case for the majority, or almost all, I think, of the other Epstein accusers that have come forward in public in various ways. They claim that to the extent that they were harmed, it was by Epstein himself and or Maxwell. Not that they were trafficked out to all these like prominent world leaders and so forth. That was mostly something that was conjured up by Giuffre. And one of the original people against whom she leveled that accusation was Alan Dershowitz. And people, if whatever else you might think of Dershowitz, I disagree with him on many things. I've talked to him personally about my disagreements on Israel, on other issues. Other things I agree more with him on. That's life. But whatever my general feelings on him, the idea that even if even if I've disagreed with him on everything, every substantive issue, that I would therefore feel was necessary for me to participate in sliming him with groundless child sex trafficking accusations, that's ridiculous. Like, who reasons that way? If you find yourself reasoning in that way, time out, press pause on your video game controller, and like figure out how to reconfigure your mental thought processes there, because something is seriously amiss. But I would encourage people to go look at the litigation history of this claim against Dershowitz. I find it to just be obviously and conclusively in Dershowitz's favor in terms of him vehemently denying that he had illicit sexual interactions with this person, and that the claims were fabricated. Now, I remember Dershowitz being constantly hounded by these claims in the media by people who have other political grievances against him, throwing this into his face and assuming that he must be lying or trying to evade accountability. But then, lo and behold, by late 2022, the litigation finally gets resolved. And what's the outcome? Well, Virginia Giuffre, by way of her lawyer, David Boies, who I would love to tally up. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I should do this. So I'm going to make a mental note, or I'll put it in my Google Doc. I would love to know how much money David Boies' firm, the firm of David Boies, Boies, very prominent, high-powered attorney, who has long had a relationship with Dershowitz, but in the case of this Epstein debacle, ended up as a bitter adversary of his, because he was representing Giuffre. But nonetheless, Giuffre and Boies, by late 2022, finally had to acknowledge, pursuant to a settlement with Dershowitz, that Giuffre had falsely accused Dershowitz of depraved sexual crimes for approximately 8 years straight. Now, if you don't accept that information could in any way detract from the credibility of the chief accuser in the whole Epstein drama, then I don't know how to necessarily reason with that. Like, what would detract from somebody's credibility if not that, right? Hence, there was a reason. And that's, by the way, that's not the only thing that she had to retract or recant or revise over the years. And it's not just like dates or quibbles over minor details. It's about her claiming to have seen, like, she claimed that Al Gore at one point was at some event that she was at, and it was basically just disproven. What seems to have happened is that she got in cahoots with a certain journalist from the Daily Mail right around the time that she started to come public with this stuff, and she was encouraged or egged on to like maximally dramatize her claims so she could maybe get a book deal, maybe she could continue to get paid for giving interviews, and then she could use her wild claims to extract settlements from powerful individuals with whom Epstein was affiliated, like Wexner and so forth. That seems like the plausible reason why she ended up down so many of these rabbit holes. Again, not that she was never victimized under any circumstances, or not that I'm like denying in totality that she could have been harmed on any level. I just think that there was such an obvious incentive for her to maximally dramatize everything, including by just naming a bunch of prominent people that maybe were in Epstein's orbit at some point, or maybe not. But anybody she could plausibly accuse, she would just accuse. Um, and it always, I mean, I remember hearing about it when it first came out, like over a decade ago or so, around a decade ago, and thinking it not very plausible. It seemed like she was just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what stuck. And it turns out that as her claims got adjudicated in an adversarial legal process, they continuously fell apart. So she was not called as a witness. And the one time that there was a full fledged criminal trial to adjudicate Epstein related claims, which was the Ghislaine Maxwell trial of 2021, Virginia Giuffre was not called to testify. She was not called as a witness. Maxwell was convicted, and Giuffre's aspects of her testimony were actually later included in a sentencing memo, which is constitutionally questionable, I would argue, given that she was not one of the named victims in the trial. But leaving that aside, the four women who were called by prosecutors did not allege, none of the four alleged that they had been trafficked by Epstein or Maxwell to a third party individual. So, in other words, none of the four whose allegations were most thoroughly adjudicated through cross examination, through the rigors of a criminal trial, none of those four even claimed or even made an allegation that would substantiate the Virginia Giuffre allegation of rampant third party sex trafficking. So beyond just the nexus of Maxwell and Epstein, uh, in such a way as it, broadens out to this sweeping uh, trafficking and blackmail network that people want to posit exists with total certainty. None of the four in the criminal trial made the claim that that's what occurred. Okay. Prosecutors could have potentially called Giuffre, but her credibility would have been impeached like that, because her credibility, I'm sorry if you don't want to hear this, her credibility was in tatters. And as the person who was most responsible for generating the whole mythology around Epstein, to have her credibility be in tatters such that she was not even going to be called to, as a witness in the marquee trial to hold to account the Epstein sex trafficking ring, I think should make people at least pause and reflect on whether the thing that they're so sure exists for some reason really exists, or is there reasonable doubt? Is their certainty overstated? Like, sometimes I feel like I'm being a little gaslit because a lot of this seems just very obvious and straightforward, and like I'm not making hugely uh, sort of I'm not making speculative inferences. Really, I'm not getting beyond the factual record that much. Just kind of reciting what has gone on with this case, and people like find it offensive and appalling to even hear these facts recited to them. I don't know. It's odd. Um, So I'd just like to know, why isn't that information that I just spelled out more widely understood in terms of people who claim to be so infuriated by the Epstein files or the lack thereof? Doesn't get a whole lot of traction on social media when you point it out. In fact, it gets people really quite upset. They just don't want to hear it. I think there is like a psychic. Now, here's where I will get a little bit more speculative because I'm beyond. I'm not dealing in the facts of the case at the moment, but I think there is sort of like a psychic explanation for why people get so upset about this. Like there's something almost comforting about this belief. Like you, it simplifies the universe almost to think that like there's this one Rosetta Stone called the Epstein files that the truly virtuous heroes among us would liberate from its captivity in some government bunker, and then that would shine the light on the true elite depravity in the universe. Um, or there's something like validating or energizing or again comforting to think that the way to understand elite misbehavior, elite misdeeds or malfeasance is by way of this description of just sexual depravity, right? People want to think that. I mean, they get some psychic gratification out of it. I think that's based on my own observations of how this thing functions. Um, and so they don't feel themselves to be constrained by like the empirical data. They uh, eliminate all kind of epistemic guardrails. Hence, like the wild extrapolations that they'll make. So people will cling to like a million different data points that suggest something suspicious or sleazy or untoward going on. And I don't deny that there's untoward stuff that went on with respect to Epstein. Obviously, the whole thing was a pretty crazy story, but they'll like make these logical leaps that just don't add up. Like they'll say, "Oh, Epstein had these dealings with such and such." What, you're just telling me that blah blah blah? Like, I'm not telling you anything. I'm telling you that if you're going to make this sweeping extrapolation that this child sex trafficking network and blackmail operation obviously existed and is being covered up, then like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They don't require like a hunch or like where there's smoke there's fire or something like this. Like anything other than actual factual substantiation will be proffered to establish these claims that people want to make or these assumptions that people just harbor for no particular reason that is evident again in the factual record. I would argue. Um, Now, does this mean I would say I would like demand everybody like stop investigating Epstein, leave him alone, or leave everybody who might have been associated with alone? No, everybody investigate all they want. Investigate to your heart's content. Should the government maximize transparency? Sure. However, when Trump worries that if the government were just to do a like an indiscriminate document dump of everything that it has related to Epstein, so like everything that prosecutors have gathered over the years, um, and anybody who might be on some, I don't know, Rolodex, and just throw it out there, then yeah, even people who are not accused or not even under suspicion of committing any crime whatsoever are going to have their reputation impugned, right? People have been doing that for years just with respect to the run of the mill litigation. So when a certain like record becomes unsealed and it says that so and so was in some record somewhere that Epstein or Maxwell kept, like they had their phone number or whatever, that's immediately used to cast the most kind of damning aspersion on that person. So obviously there's some competing interests to weigh here. I'm in favor of maximum transparency, maximum uh, disclosure of records, etc. But I am still mindful that people have been defamed to high heaven on the basis of this story. Dershowitz was defamed. I mean, if somebody had accused you for 8 years straight of committing acts of criminal sexual predation upon children, and that was false, and then your accuser had to eventually admit that it was false, weren't you defamed? Like, am I going crazy here? And Giuffre made the same accusation against a whole host of other people without a shred of credible evidence that ever was provided. And yes, now she is deceased. Look, I offer my deepest sympathies for that. However, like that doesn't somehow absolve her from scrutiny if we're all going to be saddled with this narrative. And if it's going to be such a politically uh, turbocharged issue, it must be critically evaluated, right? Um, and people will say, like, Epstein mythology, which I differentiate from the more solidly established aspects of the whole Epstein saga, which are in the record that I'm not denying, but there's like a mythological component here that has enveloped uh, people and goes well beyond the plainly sort of factual components. Like again, the idea that there's this sprawling child sex trafficking ring wherein prominent individuals had children trafficked to them and then were surreptitiously taped and then blackmailed. I know people really desperately want to believe that, but that, to my mind, exists in the realm of mythology because it's never been substantiated. Like over the course of the last 10 years, and given how much of a feeding frenzy has broken out in terms of the spigots opening for all kinds of settlements that anybody who could make the most tenuous possible claim of damages related to Epstein could make and be given millions of dollars. Why hasn't there been one settlement of a prominent person who Epstein had trafficked supposedly children to, who then settled? Really, 10 years? How about all the journalistic resources that have been devoted to the story for 10 years? Netflix, HBO, books, article, everything, podcasts. Really, nobody's found proof of like just one person, one third party individual to whom minors were trafficked. Like, wouldn't you expect at least one example of it if it's so indisputably true? Does that make people just pause for a second and examine what their assumptions are here? I'm not exonerating Epstein. Clearly, the guy was, to put it mildly, a creep. No argument. He did procure teenage girls for his own uh, perverse gratification. No doubt. However, doesn't mean that you can just draw any wild speculative inference that you would want to, because it gives you comforting psychic uh, satisfaction about the nefarious elites and how society is structured according to this perpetual need to cover up demonic child sex trafficking. Like, that's clearly there's a widespread desire to do that out in the public, particularly on the internet. But I think it needs to be rationally refuted if there is not ample basis to make those claims. Otherwise, people get deranged, people get unhinged, people are in, like, look at what's been going on the past 2 days. I mean, people are in like a stupor. And yes, I place blame in large part on these right wing media organs and uh, Trump administration officials who went around teasing imminent revelations from the so-called Epstein files, which likely never existed as such. Like, what were ever the Epstein files? That was just sort of like a trope. There was never one file that was concealed. I mean, files have been continuously released for 10 years through, again, litigation being unsealed and whatnot. Are there records that are still yet to be disclosed? I'm sure there are. Please disclose them. Be my guest. But like the cosmic significance that was ascribed to something called the Epstein files, which once unveiled would expose all the wrongdoing that had been systematically concealed from the truth-loving patriotic Americans. That was, again, mythology. That's a thing that existed more in the realm of mythology than demonstrable fact all along. So yeah, I do blame Patel, Bongino, etc., who were just playing to the crowds by teasing Epstein stuff, making outlandish claims, and then do a rug pull once they get into power. The problem is, instead of denouncing those people for their political charlatanism and their self-serving tactics to rile everybody up and get them excited to vote Republican, vote in Trump, and we'll defeat the deep state together. And the natural extension of that would be to expose the Epstein files, quote unquote, whatever those are exactly. Rather than criticize those people for their charlatanism and their hucksterism and their recklessness and their willingness to foment like just rank credulity and paranoia and so forth amongst their followers. Rather than criticize these political figures for that, what's happening is they're being criticized for now adding another layer of this eternal cover-up. So people who've been criticizing me lately have sometimes said or claimed that, oh, look at what he's doing. Now you're just believing the government. You're just believing the Trump administration. No, it's not. That's not it. If anything, I've been calling for, and I did this in the article that I wrote today, I've been calling for a denunciation of the government insofar as these people whipped up a frenzy on totally specious grounds for the sake of their own advancement, for political expediency, and the results were predictable. So that's very worthy of denunciation. But I'm not going to denounce them for adding another whole dimension to the supposed cover up, given that the thing that is said to be covered up cannot be established with any fidelity to the factual record. So That's an irony here. There's plenty of people worthy of condemnation, except they're generally being condemned for the wrong thing, in my estimation, uh, which is strange. Now, do I want to be permanently embroiled in this issue? No, not really. Um, it is intriguing, I guess. I hadn't read the full Bureau of Prisons Inspector General report on the Epstein death in custody until today. And I didn't realize, I'm sure this was reported, but again, I felt like I spent every waking moment thinking, scrambling to get the latest next juicy tidbit about Epstein for the past 6 years. But and I think this report came out either a year ago or 2 years ago. I didn't realize that on the day that Epstein died in his cell, he modified his his last will and testament. Like, he was with his lawyers and he basically created a new will. I also hadn't realized that he was able to make an unmonitored phone call to someone. Interesting. The report says that the recipient of the unmonitored phone call that he was permitted to make against regulations was to somebody in Belarus, which is interesting. And I hadn't seen the photos that were taken of the interior of his cell after he was declared deceased. But that's all in that report. And, it does lend some credence to the idea that he just killed himself. Now, do I know that for certainty? No. We can't often know things with total certainty in life. But there's a lot of evidence in that report that weighs in favor of the suicide thesis. Could there be other information that comes out that contradicts that? Sure. But, modifies his last will and testament, had been placed on suicide watch because of a prior attempt in July. Then he, finishes the act in August. People say, "Oh, the guards did not make the correct check-ins on the correct schedule that night or something." Really going to hinge this all on the competency, like the flawless professional competency of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, of the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York? Really? I would be shocked if they were competent. I would be shocked if that was a seamless operation. I mean, do you know anything about, if you've ever looked into prison culture, you'll know just how it's like an underworld and has its own way of organizing itself. The guards, the inmates are kind of in communion with one another, essentially. So there's all kinds of payoffs and deals and factions, and it differs from institution to institution. But I wouldn't be shocked at all if he was able to pay somebody off to get a unmonitored phone call. I mean, obviously most prisoners don't have anything like the resources that he has. Or he also was able to get extra, I think it was bedding and clothing and blankets and so forth. Yeah, I mean, he has an account to pay for that if he makes a deal with the guard. I mean, that happens all the time. So after having read that report, which anybody can Google, I'm not saying it's the be all end all or the final word on the matter necessarily, but it gives some credence to the suicide thesis. And I saw somebody saying today, well, why did he kill himself if there's no list? Really? So, like, you think because there's no quote unquote list, whatever that is, that Epstein wouldn't have had any reason to kill himself? Like he wasn't incarcerated, like he wasn't on track to be convicted of serious federal felonies, like he wasn't being going to be deprived in perpetuity, maybe for the rest of his life of his lavish lifestyle. You can't think of the reason why he might have been motivated to kill himself in those circumstances. Um, I mean, he almost certainly was going to be convicted uh, if he stood trial, and he might because it was openly acknowledged that he enjoyed the company of females who were not of age. So I don't think the government would have had a difficult time marshaling the evidence needed. Um, so yeah, I mean, just I think sometimes people get a little bit crazy about over interpreting some of these things. Again, there will always be some new nugget of information to uncover. I just think if you're now in like this uh, state of like paralyzed confusion and you can't understand why he would have killed himself if there's no quote list. I mean, I don't know. I think you're off track. Um, in conclusion, and I'll see if there's are there any super chats here? If you're watching on YouTube and you want to give a super chat, somebody says, Michael, the Epstein things about blackmail, sex trafficking just happened to be the vehicle. I'm not sure what that means. Is there any evidence of blackmail? Like, give me one piece of evidence that blackmail occurred pursuant to this child sex trafficking ring. That was the quote unquote vehicle for the blackmail. I know people want to believe that there was blackmail. They think he was connected to intelligence agencies. Maybe he did interface with intelligence agencies, including Israeli agencies. That wouldn't shock me in the slightest. Why? Because he was able to consort with all manner of prominent people. I mean, if you can insinuate yourself into the social circles of both Donald Trump and Bill Clinton in the span of years, then yeah, you're probably capable of a lot of adventurous stuff. You could easily come into contact with somebody from one of these agencies. Okay. I mean, I'm allowing for that possibility. But if you're going to claim there was blackmail, then you got to show me some evidence establishing that there was blackmail. And blackmail of what? Him entrapping the powerful individuals in sexually compromising situations and putting it on tape? Okay, show the evidence. Like people just surmise that, or they just want to infer that, and they don't feel that they have any obligation to produce a shred of evidence. I'm conceding to the plausibility, but if you're going to assert something as factually true, then the burden is on you to substantiate that, right? I think, unless I'm going a little bonkers here. Um, where was I? Okay, so what's interesting about this story is I think not the details of the story. So one thing that's interesting about how this is all transpired in terms of the rug pull of the deprivation of the Epstein files, quote unquote, is the way how this Epstein issue sort of functioned in political rhetoric or political discourse or the political scene in the past year or so, because it was definitely utilized, leveraged by people in the Trump orbit to convince people to vote for Republicans. Now, how did it come to pass that somehow it became a salient argument to make to certain, mostly heavily online demographics that if you wanted the Epstein files, you should vote Republican? Like, how that doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily like a natural conclusion anyone should make, right? Well, I mean, my thesis is that with the ascendance of online media, social media, gradually supplanting traditional media, particularly in terms of younger consumers, different arguments need to be made to tailor uh, to appeal to those audiences, right? So like Trump would go on Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, Andrew Schulz, all these other sort of podcasters that have a younger leaning audience, and so the Trump sort of people were marinating in that conspiracy inflected sort of media ecosystem. I would say conspiracism more than conspiracy inflected, maybe, because conspiracism I think more of as a habit of mind or like an epistemic approach more so than a particular adherence to a particular conspiracy, right? People just like enjoy conspiracies. They think in terms of conspiracies, right? Doesn't mean they're always wrong. I'm just saying that's their sort of frame of mind. And so if that's the frame of mind, if that's sort of the ethos of a particular media outlet or uh, cross section of social media personalities or whomever, and you need to appeal to them politically for the purposes of getting to them to vote in an upcoming election, a perfect thing to do is to dangle the little Epstein files prize in front of their face, so they're uh, grasping at it like I don't know a dog or something, having baloney dangled in front of their nose, and that will probably impel a decent number of them to go and vote Republican because you're dismantling the deep state, right? And Epstein is being protected by the deep state, right? And Trump will save us from the deep state with Cash Patel and all this stuff. Like the logic makes sense in terms of why it could be potentially a persuasive message to sell to a certain demographic that's not going to be amenable to or receptive to other forms of political argumentation, more traditional forms. Um, so I actually would credit, just from the standpoint of like raw political tactics, the people who did, people in the administration who did tease this stuff and did whip up frenzied anticipation around it, like JD Vance on Theo Vaughn. People passing this clip around from last October, I think, saying, "Yeah, we just got to release the Epstein files." And Theo Vaughn's like, "Yeah, man," and like the whole crowd's cheering, "Yeah!" It's like the crowd goes wild. It's like somebody hit a home run. All you have to do is name drop Epstein, and people get all like titillated, ready to march to the polls to vote in Republicans. It's kind of ingenious when you think about it. So I give them all the credit in the world from the standpoint of like a pure political strategy. And I think that's the framing that I would kind of more emphasize in terms of how, if you want to criticize this, if you need something to denounce, criticize the hucksterism, criticize the cheap political tactics, the manipulation, the exploitation. Again, the encouragement of just abject credulousness by these self-serving political figures. Not the newest phenomenon to ever burst onto the scene, self-serving political rhetoric, but I think this is another example of it. So that's what I'm encouraging people to focus on more so than, oh my God, Donald Trump he's now Donald Trump is joining Joe Biden and covering up pedophilic sex rings because he doesn't want to bring him to justice and he wants to save the prominent people from ruin who were implicated in the blackmail ring, and he's doing it for Israel. Like, one thing that makes me a bit dubious about this whole blackmail angle is the idea that, really, I mean, you need to coerce people like Alan Dershowitz or Donald Trump or Bill Clinton into supporting Israel by sexually blackmailing them. Like, there's no other reasons that anybody can think of why those people might be inclined to support Israel. Anyway, the One Nation Under Blackmail book, I've looked at it. It's not. You know what? I'm going to reserve a full-fledged. I'm going to refrain from offering a full-fledged opinion because I have not read enough of it yet. But what I have read, I'm not impressed by. There's very little coherent organization to it. it's just a smattering of information. I'm sure some of it is interesting research, but like it's just sort of it's all over the place. It's like it reminds me of what happens when I talk to somebody on like a Twitter space and they're trying to like make the pro Epstein mythology argument. It zigs and zags and veers, and there's like a million tangents, and they can't keep together a coherent train of thought. Right? Um, they can't keep themselves tethered to a coherent, consistent train of thought. That's what I find. Um, Maybe I don't always succeed in that either. I don't know. I guess I can't judge myself, but that's what I observe, and it reminds me a little bit of what I've seen so far of that book. But I'll look more. I'll read more into it. I haven't read all like 890 pages or whatever it is. Um, what was I going to say? One more thing. No, I'm losing my train of thought. Maybe because it's getting late. I can't remember now. That's okay. I think that's about enough. I think you get the gist. Um, Somebody does a super chat. The Epstein files is Russiagate for the online dissident right. Actually, that's not a bad. There are certain similarities there. You know, nothing is ever directly analogous, but here are the ways in which those things might be analogous. I find, people would say to me, it's similar in that people will make the where there's smoke, there's fire claim. Like with Russiagate, it was always there's these scattershot data points that people could throw together that were supposed to suggest suspicious uh, Russian contacts, right? Russian contacts were themselves supposed to be suspicious. So people would, desperately search for any extraneous data point that they could throw into the pot. And even though they all like, didn't really add up to anything that was decipherable, or there was no like through line necessarily to be discerned, what we were told was where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So there doesn't have to be a coherent explanation for anything, really. It's just look at the breadth of data points that were, in a scattershot way, just kind of throwing at the wall and seeing what sticks. And there's a similar tendency here, I think. Again, not a perfect analogy, but I think there's a certain like modes of disorganized thought or confirmation biased thought that are kind of operative here, and that are also a conspiracy inflected, because Russiagate was nothing if not a conspiracy, right? What was the conspiracy? The main, the core contention, and it was always like broadening out at different domains, so you could never like keep track of like its parameters. But if there was any core essence of it to be that it could be distilled into, it was Putin illicitly installed Trump into the presidency and subverted the American electoral process, right? Um, there you go. And there was never any credible evidence for that. But that didn't stop people from asserting, "Oh, well, there's where there's smoke, there's fire," because Mike Flynn met with Sergei Kislyak, the ambassador, the Russian ambassador, and also, and George Papadopoulos and Donald Trump Jr. and blah 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 blah. There was always some kind of smoke that they could point to. And I think there's a little bit something similar here, because the core contention is not substantiated at all. The core contention in Epstein is, again, I'll repeat it: Epstein orchestrated a child sex trafficking ring. He entrapped prominent individuals into sexually compromising situations, got them on film, blackmailed them. Blackmailed them toward what end? Not quite sure. Was it for Israel? Maybe. Who knows? but that's like the core contention, right? And that's also not substantiated. So what's people say, where there's smoke, there's fire. Like we'll say in that One Nation Under Blackmail book, they go back to Roy Cohn, they go back to stuff in the 70s or 50s, or it's a giant volume of information that's not necessarily unified behind any particular thesis. I don't think, based on what I've been able to gather so far. Maybe again, I'm getting ahead of myself because I admittedly have not read the whole thing, but that's the impression I get. And when people say you should read that book, why aren't people who are constantly recommending that book able to kind of, distill or crystallize the core argument that you think is so revelatory from that book? It's just read the book. Like, okay, like give me a concise sentence, a couple of sentences that represents the argument that you think I need to be more cognizant of. Like, why are you recommending the book? Like, again, distill it into a few sentences. People don't seem to be able to do that. There's one other point that I was going to make, and now I can't remember. I can't remember. Anyway, I guess that's enough. You kind of see where I'm coming from. Like I said, in conclusion, I know people are just totally outraged about my views on this, which I find kind of bewildering, I have to say, because I don't know. I perceive myself as like pretty within the bounds of rational inquiry here, and lots of people disagree. So, what are you gonna do? Self promotion. Sorry, mtracy.net, mtracy on YouTube, uh, mtracy on X. People are watching on all three platforms right now, so that's nice. But subscribe to each one of them if you're curious. That'll do it for now. I know I have to wrap up because I'm getting a little delirious given the late hour. So don't want to get myself into any more trouble. Okay, one more comment. And this is emblematic of the kind of comments I've been inundated with. Somebody says, Tracy has to pay the bills just like we do. Selling out was his way out. Good for you, Tracy. On behalf of everyone else, F you. Who do you guys think I've sold out to? Like, I wish somebody was just like giving me a bunch of money to make this argument. In fact, if you want to talk about selling out, it's probably it's contrary to my just raw financial interests, if we want to get into that, to even be discussing this, because people will mass unfollow or unsubscribe from me. So again, what you people don't understand, I don't think, is that in these online media spheres, which I inhabit, I'd be much better off just pumping out the red meat on Epstein stuff. Oh yeah, Mossad, pedos, etc. That's what I would be better off doing if I wanted to just maximize my remuneration. So, ironically, it's the opposite. Like when I get accused of that, people don't seem aware that it would actually be the reverse. Like if I wanted to just get more money, I guess I would pander to the algorithmic mobs, to the masses, right? I mean, people hate this when I talk about it. It's extremely unpopular online. It's happened before. There have been other stories where I can remember similar reactions. You got to power through it, I guess. But it's just funny when people will make that accusation. And I've gotten a lot of people saying that, oh yeah, I've been bought off or I've been compromised. Like who would be? I mean, I don't know. People always want to fish for that explanation, and it's just it's a little silly. Okay, I am gonna log off now. I'm getting drowsy. So follow me all those places. Again, there's an article today for Compact Magazine. I posted some excerpts on Substack, mtc.net. It's in the description box on YouTube. I also tweeted it, so you should be able to find it pretty easily. Subscribe on YouTube. More stuff coming soon. Am I done with this topic? I kind of like to be, uh, but we shall see. All right. Good night.